Here is a block that we see often as quilters. It's a bear paw. It's a very traditional block, and as such I like to quilt it in a more traditional fashion. Here you can see where I have just used a continuous curve along the outside of the block. I have hit all the intersections so I can keep those intersections down, and that causes the piecing itself to be showcased here. And as I get to the interior of the paw, I like to add another element, or in this case it's another pattern. I have done this whole block in point-to-point mode, but I did exit in and out of that mode and changed patterns as I went. The sequence in which I put the patterns in determines how they're sewn, and as a result, this entire block will sew continuously without stops or tie-offs. I could also do an entire row of these blocks, and let me show you how I did that. First, I'm going to draw it out for you, and then I'll show you the steps on the Statler. I like to start in the lowest left-hand corner. I would do this by clicking in point to point. I would click, 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 click. Here I'm hitting all the intersections. When I get to this point, I'm going to exit out of point to point and change patterns, get back into point to point. Then I can click, 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 exit out, change patterns, back into point to point, click, 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 exit out, change patterns, go back into point to point. Now I'm going to click about a hopping foot's distance from that edge of that claw down to about a hopping foot's distance, click and click, exit out, change patterns, and I'll continue clicking around this, hitting all the intersections. Of course, I can sew so much better than I draw, and I think that's true of a lot of us. I'm going to also show you a path that I could take if I wanted to do an entire row of these. Just come down to here. Now the first time I get to an intersection, I like to make the changes and move into the other pattern. The reason I do that is, in case I forgot the first time, I still have a second opportunity. I try to make much of what I do a habit, and that would be the case of the first time you get there to make the change. Always do it the first time. And then I would just keep clicking around. I'm going to set this whole thing up, and then of course I will sew it. On something like this where I stop and start at the same spot, I usually take my tie-offs off, and then I would manually sew right over this line to do my tie-off. Now let me show you how I did this on the Statler. Okay, now I have a row of bear paws on this quilt, and I want to really make the piecing stand out because this is a sampler quilt. She's showing how she can do a lot of different piecing, and I'm going to use not an outline, but a continuous curve around the outside of this bear paw. Now I have gone and put in my boundary. I just clicked around the piecing segments using Create Boundary. I wouldn't do this normally, but I want you to see how this pattern evolves. Now we're going to use point to point, and I'm going to use two patterns in here. One is the point to point curve, so I want to make that the size to fit this piecing. I'm going to change this to 0.2 instead of 2. I really don't need to worry about the width at this point because my freeze aspect is off. My width will adjust with my clicking. What I want to do is set my height, which is 0.2. Now I'm going to go into this point-to-point curve. Both of these were on my Statler when I purchased it, these patterns, and they're extremely versatile.
Now this one I'm going to change as well, and let's put that one on 0.25. I think that's a good height. All right, so we're going to start with the point-to-point curve, and I'm going to go into my point-to-point. Make sure with this little triangle on the side that you are in pattern, because we're dealing with a pattern here. I very seldom use point-to-point line. Okay. Oh, I better move this out of the way so you can see what we're going to do, because it's going to be way cool. Come on out of here. Well, there. Okay, I always start my point-to-points in the lowest left-hand corner. It's a habit, and that way I know the direction I'm going. And this point-to-point, we want to go left to right. It's kind of like how you read, if you think of it in those terms. If you read this way, I'm going to start down here as far as I can, go into point-to-point, and click, click, click. I am clicking around the piecing, as you can see. Now I've got to this point. I'm going to walk over to my, many of you do this from your machine head, but I'm going to do it from my screen. I'm going to get out of point to point by clicking on the X, and I'm going to enter into point-to-point curve. I have left my machine head exactly where it was. Occasionally I might get a slight bobble. I'm going to go back into point-to-point. Oh, got to move this again so we can see. You have to click once to start this. Then I'm going out to about hopping foot's width in from that point. I'm then going down to a hopping foot's width in from my seam line down here, putting another one back out here, and now back to the center where I started. I'm going to exit out of this, go back into point-to-point curve, back into point-to-point. I got to move it again. Well, you're going to very quickly see what I'm doing here. I'm moving back and forth between two separate patterns, and I'm doing it in a fashion that it will sew continuously. So I'm going to click here. Now I'm going to make a little inside of my square. I'll get out of this and go into this. This can be kind of tedious, but believe me, it's better than all those starts and stops. And when you sew this out, you're going to want to take off your ties so that it doesn't stop between segments. Otherwise, your machine will stop at these intersections where I move between my patterns, and I don't want that to happen. So go back to point. Okay, I'm going to leave that there now. You kind of know what I'm doing. Besides, you'll see it next time I move it. Now I'm going around all these outsides, and this may seem tedious, but this is custom work, and my customers pay me for it. Now here you can see I've clicked around this entire block by clicking on my points and going back and forth out of these two patterns. I like this effect